Alright guys, welcome back. So we've been alluding to this whole idea that cells need energy in order to do work. So what does that mean? Well, when we look at cellular work, it typically comes in three main forms. We've got the mechanical, the actual moving of cell structures, right? Moving basal bodies to make a flagella push a cell through its environment. Changing structures like motor proteins and moving them around to allow organelles or molecules to move throughout a cell. The utilization of spindle fibers to make chromosomes move during cell division, right? Those are all mechanical movements, mechanical work. Transport work go back to the active transport, right? Moving, pumping systems, protein pumps, doing things like that, right? Moving substances across a membrane, across their concentration gradient, something like the sodium potassium pump that we talked about, proton pumps that we'll talk about, things like that. And then you have the chemical work where we're actually doing the additional work of forcing endergonic reactions to occur, right? Things that wouldn't spontaneously happen on their own. All of this is powered typically by the utilization of ATP, right? So when we talk about those exergonic reactions, those reactions that release extra energy, your cells do the best that they can to store as much of that release in the form of ATP so that we can use that ATP then as the energy currency to do all of this work. And a lot of times we'll couple exergonic reactions with endergonic ones. So again, using the excess energy from those endergonic reactions, oh, by the way, like the breakdown of ATP, to then drive endergonic reactions that wouldn't happen without that excess energy. So ATP, you got to know it. It comes up everywhere. So some basics, right? It stands for adenosine triphosphate. So essentially, it is a ribose molecule here. It's a modified nucleotide, right? So I've got that ribose sugar. I've got, in this case, the nitrogenous base is an adenine. And then it's a modified nucleotide because typical nucleotides will have the base, the sugar, and a single phosphate. In this case, we've got the adenine base, the ribose sugar, but three phosphate groups. And shoving on these extra phosphates, there's a lot of potential stored chemical energy in the bonds that are holding those phosphates to those oxygens here in this chain. All right, and so by breaking off those phosphate groups, we end up releasing a lot of excess energy that I can then couple with an endergonic reaction that wouldn't end up going very well by itself. So again, it's that release of energy here by doing the hydrolyzation, the hydrolysis reaction of breaking off that phosphate. All right, and then I can add that phosphate to something else by phosphorylating it. That can also help to drive change in the cell. So when I look at the actual free energy components to this, right, here's just an example, right? I'm bonding glutamic acid to ammonia. It's an endergonic reaction overall. It's got a positive free energy change, meaning I have to dump more energy into the chemical reaction in order to get it to work than I get out when the product gets formed. But if I phosphorylate the ATP, right, go through, break down that ATP, add that phosphate to that glutamic acid, all right, get ADP out of it, I can then displace that phosphate group when I'm attaching it to the ammonia, all right, and so I get what would be a typical positive free energy, use the release of that free energy by that negative free energy coming from the breakdown of ATP, and so the overall net change is still negative, and so I am utilizing my energy in a much more efficient way, right? So that I can get this to work without having to expend excess amounts of energy. Add in the enzymes, and we can increase the energy expenditure even more. So again, all of that cellular work is really driven by the utilization of ATP, but it's driven by the phosphorylation process. So adding those phosphate groups from the ATP when I release it to another molecule, that recipient molecule becomes phosphorylated, and then I can use the breaking off of that phosphate to drive what I need. So here's an example of that in mechanical work. I mentioned the motor proteins, right? So we'll add phosphates from ATP to the motor protein. When I release that phosphate group, I break it back off, I release that excess free energy, and I also force the protein to change shape. And so I can get that mechanical movement. It's literally add the phosphate, cause it to attach to the cytoskeletal structure, release the phosphate, protein changes shape, it releases, and is able to grab essentially further up on that skeletal structure. We've seen the transport work, things like the sodium potassium pump. So adding that phosphate group changes the protein shape, allows us to do something with it, removes the phosphate again. And then there is the example we just saw with the glutamic acid creating glutamide, right, from the glutaric acid to the ammonia, so the chemical work. We have sort of talked about this side of things, right, the using the ATP to do something. What we're going to get to as we continue moving forward is how do I put this back together, right? Once I use that ATP, I have now lowered the amount of energy capable of coming out of breaking off more phosphates. I can do it, and there are cases where your cells will, but you're not going to get as big of a release of energy as we saw back here, right? This will be a lower number, which means its ability to drive certain processes decreases as well. So we're going to have to rebuild that ATP, and we're going to take a look at how your cells are capable of doing that as we continue moving forward here. But it's a renewable source, right? So that ATP, thankfully, is something that we can replenish. So those catabolic pathways that we are utilizing, those endergonic energy releasing processes, we will be able to store at least some of the energy that gets released from those catabolic processes to reform the ATP from the free-floating ADP and the phosphates, so that I can then use the chemical energy stored, that potential energy stored in the ATP, use some water to break it down, and be able to go through endergonic energy consuming processes as a result.
Textbooks define metabolism, a topic in biochemistry, as a series of chemical reactions that take place inside of our bodies to sustain life. Now, this is a pretty broad definition of metabolism. So in this video, I really want to break this definition down to a more workable understanding of what metabolism really is. So first, I'm going to introduce another arrow in this diagram like this and say that really the requirements of life, let's say in a human being, such as, maintaining a constant internal temperature, reproducing, growing, and all that jazz, all of that ultimately boils down to the body's ability to utilize 4 essential biomolecules. And these 4 essential biomolecules, or as they're sometimes known as macromolecules, are proteins, fats, carbohydrates or carbs, and nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. And ultimately, all of these biomolecules perform different life-sustaining reactions inside of all of the cells in our body to ultimately promote life. So as you can see, we've already begun to break down this definition of metabolism. Essentially, what we're saying here is that metabolism is really the study of how we're able to obtain these important biomolecules to sustain life. So how do we obtain these biomolecules? Now, the simple answer to this question is, of course, that we eat food to obtain all of these important biomolecules. But there's an important word of caution here, which is that since most food comes from living organisms like plants and animals, these plants and animals also contain an array of proteins, fats, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids, but not necessarily in the same flavor or configuration that our bodies would prefer. So what do our bodies do instead? Well, in our bodies, we go ahead and eat the food. It's a very large head there, but you get the idea. And in our bodies, we break down this food through a process called digestion into the component parts of all of these biomolecules. So what do I mean by component parts? Well, the smallest subunit of proteins is called an amino acid, and our body breaks down all the different types of proteins that we digest into individual amino acids. And the same pattern continues for the rest of the biomolecules. So in the case of fats, we're talking about fatty acids, which are the smallest subunits of fats. And then for carbohydrates, which are long chains of sugars, one of the most common subunits of carbohydrates that our body loves is called glucose. So I'll go ahead and write that here since you'll be seeing it a lot in the discussion of metabolism. And then finally, for nucleic acids, we're talking about nucleotides. So at this point, you're probably thinking, well, okay, I understand that our body can't use the same macromolecules found in food because maybe they're not in the right configuration, but how does breaking them down do anything for us? Now, the key here is to recognize that in our body, there's actually a delicate balance going on between the processes of breaking down molecules, such as in the process of digestion, and then taking these products and building them back up. So essentially, you can see all of these subunits or monomers as Lego pieces that we're essentially reconstructing to build the right configurations of proteins, fats, carbs, and nucleic acids that our body needs. So that's really the key idea here, which is that metabolism is a balance between breaking things down and building them back up in our body so that we can customize, so to say, what type of macromolecules that we create. And just to throw in some vocab words, biochemists call the process of breaking down molecules in our body catabolism, and a similar sounding word called anabolism is used to describe the process of building molecules back up. And the way I kind of like to remember this is looking at the first letter of each of these words. I think of C, I think of cutting molecules up into tiny pieces, so breaking them down. And then for anabolism, A, I think of as like the apex of like a building, for example. So we're building something up. Now, this seems all fine and elegant, but there's one more issue that we need to contend with, which is a consequence of having to balance breaking things down and building them back up. And that is that this process of building molecules back up requires energy, which I'm kind of indicating here by these yellow lightning bolt stars. So the question I want to answer in this last part of the video is, where does this energy come from? Now, the answer to this question is that, well, we also get this energy by eating food. So how does that work? So first, recall that the energy currency of the cell, and I'm going to go ahead and erase this just to give us some more space. The energy currency of our bodies is a molecule called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. And this high energy molecule, as it's often referred to, when it is broken down into ADP, so it loses a phosphate group, it releases usable chemical energy that can fuel energy requiring processes in our body, such as the building up process of anabolism. Now, in order for this process to continue nonstop in our bodies, ADP must be regenerated into ADP. And that is where food comes in. So remember that we digest our food into all of these subunits, and some of these subunits, such as glucose and fatty acids mainly, but occasionally amino acids, so I'm going to put that in parentheses, can essentially be used as fuels in our body. So just like wood, for example, is a fuel for a burning fire, which produces heat, these fuels in our body can essentially be broken down even further to produce the energy that's necessary to convert ADP back into ATP, and thus allowing this cycle to continue. And just to throw in another vocabulary word that you'll probably see, this process of taking these fuels, which I've indicated with this asterisk, and breaking them down into usable energy is a process that's referred to as cellular respiration. And recall that because cellular respiration involves breaking down things even further, it's also a catabolic process. So it falls under this category of catabolism. And just to tie everything here together at the end, notice here that another way to interpret this cycling between ATP and ADP is to say that catabolism fuels anabolism. So what do I mean by this? Well, essentially, catabolism, such as the process of breaking things down and extracting energy through processes of cellular respiration, is coupled with this process of building things back up. And so in essence, one relies on the other. And as you can probably guess, these processes are really tightly regulated in our bodies, because obviously you wouldn't want to be breaking down something while you're building something back up. And in fact, just to give you kind of a preview forward, catabolism and anabolism are often regulated, so controlled, through the use of hormones. So I'm going to write here that hormones are a form of regulation and tell the body whether it should be in a catabolic or anabolic state.